Welcome back, everyone, to our second session, Veterans as Civic Educators. We will now hear from civic education organizations that engage veterans in their work. Our moderator today will be Rebecca Burgess. She is a National Security Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Managing Editor and Associate Scholar of the forthcoming Classics in Strategy and Diplomacy Project. She holds a number of advisory roles and serves on the National Endowment for Humanities Task Force on Educating for American Democracy. We're also joined today by Dr. Gene Hallis, Vice President of Education at the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge. Prior to his current role, Gene has worked in higher education as a political scientist and administrator with a focus on teacher education, civic education, and he has been a leader in the developing innovative programs to combat poverty. Finally, we are joined by Dylan Del Zotto, who is the director of the Joe Foss Veterans Inspiring Patriotism Program at Arizona State University's School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Before joining the Joe Foss Institute, Dylan has served in the United States Army Reserves, and he also, in his current role, chairs the United Arizona Veterans, a nonprofit of 56 Arizona-based VSOs. Thank you again for joining us, and Rebecca, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you everyone who is joining us today for this absolutely timely and wonderful conversation about veterans and civic education, veterans as civic educators. It's a topic I think we don't often unite together. We have our veterans in their silos and civic education and educators in their silo. And I think this is an opportunity to highlight the natural connections between both. And one of the things I love to remind people or to frame the conversation we're going to have is in around the 1920s, if you go to the Midwest, the West, even California, and you look at the schools that were being built there, most often across their door frames was enter to learn and go forth to serve. And there was this idea that education was meant to help educators and the students actually give something towards society. And a few years ago, Robert Pondisio did a study of the 100 largest um, uh, education districts in the United States. So it serves about 11 million students. And he looked at the mottos of these schools. And he found that out of the 14,000 words that made up these mottos, only once was US citizenship mentioned, and only twice was democracy. 60% of these mottos had nothing at all, no words at all about citizenship or civics or responsibility or democracy. And this actually presents, I think, a very wonderful opportunity for us to see how those who have already served America can tell young students and their educators, frankly, how it is that education itself and public service can be made into an educational moment. And veterans in our history have for a long time filled this role ever since, well, probably before the Civil War, but the Civil War produced a very large veterans organization called the Grand Army of the Republic, which we see its descendants in the American Legion and others who have specifically come forth with an idea of educating young generations of Americans. And so I thought that was kind of a great way to discuss the work that you, Eugene, and you, Dylan, are doing. You both represent, your organizations almost represent that great generation coming out of World War II with Eisenhower, I believe, who started the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge, and then the Joe Foss Institute, which is, I think, really indicative of this post 9/11 moment, and how some are calling it, see, General Kelly a few years ago called it the next greatest generation, and that idea of service back. So Eugene, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge has identified or thought of itself as using veterans for civic education, a little bit about your programs and background, if you would.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Rebecca. Actually, to begin that, I'd like to backtrack a little just to give some context for sort of how we came about. And the way I usually do it is, if you've ever seen the movie Flag of Our Fathers, people forget that at the end of World War II, Many Americans had had it with the war. They just wanted it finished. They wanted the soldiers home. And Eisenhower understood that, but he was concerned about it. And his fear was that America would turn back inward and that really we needed to be engaged citizens to continue sort of that democratic tradition after the war. And he saw the soldiers as fulfilling one of those duties, that they had these unique experiences. And it's one of the many things we build on in our programs. We run programming from elementary school level all the way up to graduate programs for teachers. And infused throughout all of them are these ideas about citizenship and the need for service. And one of the ways we emphasize you can serve amongst a variety is military service. And to us, it is sort of a natural segue between those experiences and citizenship and patriotism and, commitment to democracy.
Mm-hmm. So how do you find these veteran educators, or are they often the older veterans, or are they new veterans, or have you seen a change over the years?
No, they tend to find us. We do a lot of we work specifically with our graduate programs with teachers.
Okay.
And just, I think, the nature of the subjects that we run programs about, veterans who then go on into education find us, and word spreads. And we do a fair amount of work with the Medal of Honor Society and Foundation. And one of the kind of unexpected perks there is there are a number of Medal of Honor recipients who, when they left the service, went on and became teachers. Some of recent recipient Jim McLuhan's a great example. He was retroactively awarded the Medal of Honor for actions in Vietnam. He had spent over all those decades after the war teaching economics and sociology at a high school in Michigan and coaching baseball and wrestling and all these things sort of nonstop. Another one out of Vietnam, Gary Bykirk. He actually went on to, believe it or not, to be a middle school grade counselor. And he always said his experiences in Vietnam were the best preparation for dealing with middle schoolers. But there's a number of them that just sort of, they went in that direction. And they became really good spokespeople for us, where they would go out to teachers and say, if you're a veteran, here's a place you have to look at. I mean, veterans are some of our greatest advertisers, and even non-veterans, because we have teachers who maybe they did not serve, but they have a brother, a sister, a niece, a nephew, a son, a daughter, a husband, and they go back and spread the word as well.
So I have two questions to ask you before pivoting to Dylan to hear from him. And the first is, does the veteran have to be a teacher already to be a part of your program?
Yeah, well, for the graduate programs, yes, but realize when we say a teacher, we state it broadly. We have worked with counselors, administrators, school police officers, school social workers. Our attitude and our approach is anybody directly involved with students who can somehow affect their development and character in a positive way, we'll work with them. So it's education broadly stated. I have also worked with individuals who maybe do those sort of after school support programs in places like the inner city. Anybody that works directly with students, we will engage with. That's it. And really for us, it's because of the way this is funded. Okay. Funders are giving us money specifically for teachers.
Got it.
So, but again, they deal with it broadly stated.
Right. So actually that brings up my second question, which is about the teachers. So we know in the civic education world that civic education for decades now has suffered a prolonged kind of lack of attention, lack of funding, that to the extent it is funded, it's basically privately funded, gets less money overall per year than Intel gives 1 year to the STEM field, and that the teachers of civic education are actually most in need of professional development, that there's a real lack of quality content for civic education and quality teachers. I mean, there are many wonderful civics teachers and they do it basically out of the goodness of their hearts, but there's a lot whose first name is Coach. And they didn't study civics in school. They got a degree in education maybe or something else. And so do you find that veterans, because of their prior service, have an awareness, kind of a deeper awareness of civics, or a natural ability to see what's very important in the civics world and bridge that to even help their fellow non-veteran?
To a certain extent, yes. Those experiences, they still often need to learn some of the language to articulate it, but it's there, and I'm glad you brought this up, because as you know, a political scientist who spent years teaching the capstone course for social studies teachers at my university in Pennsylvania, you know, pedagogy was over here, content was over here, and the only time they ever met was when they came in my classroom before they walked out the door, because besides a background in political science, I have a teacher certification, you know, and I had my feet in both worlds. But to take it even a little more deeply, social studies teachers are expected to teach about 8 different subjects. So they're very broadly trained, but not very deeply trained. And it's a real weakness in American education. One that, you know, I also serve on a school board in a county here in Pennsylvania and on the intermediate unit. And it's one I regularly talk about with superintendents, that, you know, in one sense, veterans are better equipped because, one, they come with the ethos from their service, which really helps them. But what honestly also helps is they also then tend to be a little bit of a history buff, and they've read a little more, I find, about certain things. And it tends to be more military history than constitutional things, but it does help them, I think, segue and engage without a doubt. They're easier students to work with is probably the way I would put it.
Right. Thank you, Eugene. So Dylan, I was wondering if you can, I think this is a really good way to segue into what the Joe Foss Veterans Inspiring Patriotism program has done in its beginnings, and how it saw veterans as natural educators to bring into classrooms. So could you give us a little bit of a background on well, maybe even starting with Joe Foss and your entire program and what you do?
Absolutely, and it's an honor to be here. And as Eugene mentioned about the Medal of Honor recipients, they tend to be kind of natural teachers. Although Joe Foss was not a teacher, he was a World War II veteran who shot down 26 planes at the Battle of Guadalcanal. And after that, Joe went on to a long career of public service, including serving as the youngest governor of the state of South Dakota, helped work with the Easter Seals charity. Just he did so much, a lot of people said it looked like he couldn't hold down a job. But the one thing that Joe really enjoyed doing was going into classrooms and talking to young students about the importance of patriotism, public service, integrity, appreciation for America's freedom. So in 2001, him and his wife, Dee Dee, founded the Institute. And since then, we've been recruiting veterans to go into classrooms and to promote those ideals. And originally, Joe wanted to just have combat veterans go into classrooms to share their personal stories. But they realized, you know, if you take a really small percent of a population and you split it even more, that it would be more difficult to have a good amount of support for this program. So the Veterans Inspiring Patriotism program continues to deploy veterans in classrooms for 30 minutes to an hour. The veteran converses with the teacher beforehand. They do a lot of personal story. Sometimes they touch on specific events in history that they personally were involved in to give kids something outside of their textbook.
Mm-hmm. About how many veterans do you have involved in your program that you're able to deploy? And this is, once again, is across all 50 states, correct?
Correct. We've had involvement in all 50 states. We have approximately 400 active veterans that we recruit through a number of ways, through the Legion, VFW, Disabled American Veterans, referrals. Veterans go through an orientation program. We put them through a background check. They have to have an honorable discharge, and they are not teachers. But Joe thought, you know, who better than somebody who put their right hand up to swear and uphold, defend the Constitution, to go into classrooms to talk about the importance of, as I mentioned, patriotism and public service, because you know, when we look in the classroom today, although these students are brilliant and they, you know, with the math and the sciences, and they take algebra 1, 2, calculus, geometry, and all these things, you know, it's such as they don't take financial literacy, which would probably be more beneficial. And this is, you know, off of the civic subject a little bit, where they, you know, understand how to compound interest, and, you know, when they buy a car, it's going to cost this much by the time they end up paying for it. But a lot of the civics and the history doesn't really touch on that kind of inspirational factor, as far as, you know, telling these kids, hey, you live in a wonderful country because of the sacrifice the veterans have made, so you need to go vote. What do you mean go vote? Well, find out what your beliefs are in your system and educate yourself. Go register to be a Democrat, a Republican, a Libertarian, an Independent, but, you know, be involved, participate in the system that we have. Because although, and we see now, you know, there's, you know, half of the country is, you know, just kind of at this disgruntled battle, and it's a main problem is a lot of the kids, they just don't know how to play the game. You know, I say the game loosely, but they just don't understand, you know, kind of how to participate in the system that we have. And I don't think they realize how wonderful we do have it in this country, although there are problems in every country. And I think the veteran speakers really bring that home, especially as Eugene mentioned, we hosted an event a few years ago, and I think we had 22 Medal of Honor recipients. And all of these veterans are extremely humble, but these Medal of Honor recipients are just a different breed, because they always felt like, you know, it should have been, or could have been, you know, a guy next to them or somebody that they served with that day that would have received that medal. So that's why the importance of using the veteran in the classroom.
Do the veterans, do you think they have a leg up, as it were, in maintaining a nonpartisan line in the classroom? So this is a question that comes to the fore a lot in civic education, or amongst civics teachers themselves. They're nervous about talking about current events because they don't really know how to do it without being ideological, well, you know, if they're aware of ideological partisanship, but definitely a partisan lens. And so either they shy away from it, or, you know, it results in, you know, these newsworthy moments where they're condemning presidents, you know, or something like that. So do you think veterans have a way of having these civic conversations that stays outside of the partisanship of the moment? Or do you give them special tools that help them in navigating those conversations?
We do, and that's a great point, especially today where everything is politicized. You can politicize anything, and civics is definitely one of those areas. Our veterans fill out an affirmation, and they're completely aware that the Joe Foss Veterans Inspiring Patriotism Program does not promote any political, military, or religious agenda. Simply, absolutely no agenda. Their job is just to simply say, hey, a lot of people in this country built on the backs of veterans, and these people that go deploy in these dangerous places, so you have unique opportunities. So exercise those unique opportunities, no matter what side of the fence they're on. Mm-hmm. I think that's why, and they do have that ability, I believe, to stay neutral.
So that makes me want to ask you about another initiative that the Joe Foss Institute has been linked with in the past, which was kind of this interest in civics education kind of made you pivot towards an actual piece of legislation that you were interested in getting across all the different state legislatures. So the Civic Education Test Initiative. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that, where the initiative came from and how that's doing?
Absolutely. You know, our board was obviously supportive for years and years and years, and continues to be, for the Veterans Inspiring Patriotism Program. But they wanted to deploy some real change in the classroom. And the one thing that they thought of, hey, if it's tested, it's taught. So they got on board with the Civic Education Initiative, which we passed in some shape or form legislation in 33 states that required some sort of civics testing as a graduation requirement. And, you know, we had bipartisan support. It was something that everybody could get behind. You know, of course, I think Eugene mentioned as well that, you know, teachers are so buried in other things. You know, I got off a webinar the other day with a teacher, and she has to teach, you know, these 5 subjects, and whatever there's time left over, literally she calls it, you know, her leftover time would be dedicated to civics, or, you know, and or history, which is a very limited amount of time. So we passed this legislation in 33 states. And I think the majority of the civics teachers, of course, said, hey, this makes us relevant. You know, we have something out there that's, you know, tested, because the funding for the schools is all dependent on the, you know, STEM and the hard sciences, and they pass the test, and then teachers get the new books and a roof on the building or whatnot. But, civics, and that's partially the reason, is because it's just not tested. So yeah, that initiative, as I mentioned, bipartisan support, passed in 33 states. We started with the citizenship test, which the Joe Foss program developed a unique version of that on our website, which you can get through the SCETL website, the School of Civic Economic Thought Leadership. That's more interactive. It has videos. We have teacher lesson plans, instructor guides, flashcards. But yeah, that was the goal with the civic education initiative. So, let's put civics on the front burner again.
Mm-hmm. Right. A few years ago, when I was with the American Enterprise Institute, we had done a very large report looking at high school civics and citizenship, and asking civic teachers themselves, what do they think would be most helpful in moving the civic education agenda, if you want to call it that, to the fore. And they said, unfortunately, having a mandated test, because that's so much of our education. And it was surprising, because so many teachers, don't want to have to teaching to a test, but they thought this is the only way that we could actually get serious investment. So, I think about that a lot in the back of my head, but also kind of the civic casing of the push across all these state legislatures, I think, is a really good thing. It doesn't come from the top down. It came, it's coming up through state legislatures. So I wanted to ask, this is a question for both of you, and maybe Eugene, you would want to go first. How typically do the school districts and the teachers respond, and then the students respond to having these veterans in the classroom? Do you see a noticeable uptick of interest? Is there some concern? These leftovers, I call it the long shadow of the Vietnam War, of just thinking, veterans are, I don't know, if they really ought to be in a classroom around students. Are they, mentally stable enough? And, all these unfortunate cliches about veterans. But how has your experience for both of you been with working with school districts and teachers and the students?
I've seen a lot of variation. There are some teachers who are very open. There are other teachers who, lack of experience, they don't know. And I've seen the same thing with administrators. I mean, here I serve on a school board, and I could offer these opportunities to the teachers in my school district. And I pushed and pushed and pushed, and there wasn't much. And what actually began to change it was the superintendent had a consultant in, and she was asking a question about civic education. And this consultant, who went through a Freedoms Foundation program as a high schooler over 25 years ago, went, there was an experience I had that was absolutely transformational, and it only lasted 4 days. And he mentioned our Spirit of America program at Freedoms Foundation, at which point the superintendent said, well, their vice president of education's on my school board. But it took that to bring the barriers down. But there's individual teachers who are veterans. They come to us and they bring things back to their classroom. And obviously the easiest ones are the JORTC, the Sea Cadet instructors. We do work with them as well, but it's a very sort of uneven horizon out there in some cases. And I think there may also be some geographic differences. Some parts of the country are a little more willing than others to bring these sort of subjects in. But we have found we incorporate veterans anytime we do a military history program. We don't just simply have a Medal of Honor recipient. We also have other veterans. In fact, I ran a World War II program for the past 3 summers for the simple reason that my fear was I was going to lose my veterans, and I lost over half of them this year. It's a real challenge. I mean, I had a guy who was from D10 all the way through to the collapse of Germany, knighted by France. He would come in and talk, and lived at the Veterans Center up the road here, and he passed away. And I had the guy who actually developed the film from the Enola Gay, and now he's not doing well. And I have one of the Rosie the Riveters, if you watch the Today Show, the one advocating for the gold medal, May Cryer, she's mine. I love her to death. She's still going. And then Woody Williams, the Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal, who's, one of the few World War II recipients still sort of talking. But I found when I bring them in teachers really resonate because it basically gives them, for lack of a better term, ammunition to use in their classroom. When they can go back to a school and say, when I was talking to this Medal of Honor recipient or this veteran from World War II or Vietnam or whatever the case might be, it puts them in they get viewed in a different perspective by their students. And it gets students thinking. We find it to be very, very helpful. And obviously we seek out those veterans who can be really, really articulate. And sometimes it happens in odd ways because Korean War veterans are very hard to find. And I have been known on Veterans Day to walk up to total strangers with Korean War vet baseball caps on in the middle of the produce section and introduce myself because they're the great white elephant in many ways. But, and sometimes it's not me. I know another guy who'd be good for you. But we generally tend to see a real positive response and a sort of multifaceted effect of for the teacher and for the veteran, because it gives the veteran a sense of fulfilling that duty of citizenship, and reinforces the idea that their service was a good and positive thing.
Right. So, I mean, that makes me think of, something that scholars or those who look at civic education kind of from the institutional level often say what's lacking in civic education is students say it's boring, because it's so much, facts and dates, as opposed to this living history kind of model. So I imagine that that's also what's powerful about it. So Dylan, could you give us a little bit of insight from what you experienced with the Joe Foss Institute and your veterans when they go into classrooms? How do the teachers respond or the school districts?
Yeah, absolutely. And, unfortunately, sometimes when you have a program that's called Veterans Inspiring Patriotism, for whatever reason, there's a connotation on that, political. People automatically gravitate to that, even though we're a 501c3. So I think you mentioned at the beginning, maybe one of the greatest civics teachers in the school would be their first title as coach. And I think about that with our program because it's amazing. The person within the school that will end up peeling together one of these VIP programs, whether if it's for a Veterans Day program or promoting it to the civics and history teachers. I had a lady in Alabama, she worked in the cafeteria and heard about us. And she was the person that was responsible for putting on their Veterans Day program. That was the person. But I find that the program is very well received because we simply do not promote any agenda. And now it's more important than ever, Eugene, as you mentioned too, there's hardly any World War II speakers that we have at all. I started at the Institute in 2008 and we had a handful. And I don't think people understand the rate of how the age of our veterans are getting so quickly, and I'll put this out, I'm almost 40 and I served in Iraq in 2003, at 21, 22 years old. People don't realize, and especially young students, they don't know a period of time that somebody that's been in the public education system from kindergarten to 18 at a time where we have not been involved in a conflict. To me, that's just, remarkable. And one, some of these vets that were in Iraq, they say they consider us the younger veterans. My platoon sergeant, when I was over there, was, in his late 40s, early 50s, and that was 17 years ago. So he's like pushing 70 years old, and he's, a young Iraq vet, and, our Vietnam vets are, well in their 80s, some of them. So I think we're well received, and I just think it's such a unique opportunity to have a veteran speaker, no matter where, where they served or what they did, come in the classroom. There's just something, the value that they bring is just, you can't get it anywhere else.
Right. So I wanted to remind the audience that we're open for questions. If you want to, pass them forward, we have time at the end to talk about them and bring them to to Dylan and to Eugene here. So something, since we're talking about how do we help promote both veterans on one hand as civic assets and on civic education on the other hand, something that funders often look at, I'm sure both your organizations have had to think through, is Funders want often to know the measurements. How do you know that this is successful or not? Is this a good investment? How have you, both of your organizations, gone about kind of measuring the impact that you have and being able to tell whether this is not just, you know, emotionally and the anecdotal, but is there any kind of data behind what you can show that helps us understand why, almost the business case for veterans in civic education?
And Dylan, if you don't mind, can I punt that question to you first? Because I have to get up from my desk and get a piece of evidence.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. You know, and that was one of the big reasons that we formed the Civic Education Initiative, because, you know, a program that's educational, inspirational, so to speak, is difficult to measure. You know, we provide the classrooms with a Likert scale type survey, and, you know, we annotate it into a SurveyMonkey, an online database, and, you know, it's off the chart as far as the teachers finding value, the students gathering something out of the presentation. But that was the one reason that we did form the Civic Education Initiative, because if we could pass something that was tested and taught, then we would absolutely know.
Mm-hmm. All right, Eugene, do you have your evidence?
I have my evidence, but before I show you my evidence, for our high school students, we have data going back literally years. We do pre and post tests for all our programs. We know high school students that go through our programs are more likely to vote, are more likely to get engaged in some form of public service. I mean, you go down all those measurements of civic ed. Our teachers, very similar sort of things. And piece of evidence I wanted to grab was, I repeatedly say to teachers at the beginning and end of any of our programs, when you go back to the classroom and you use information that you learned here in lessons and these sort of things, please, 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 please send me stuff. They don't typically remember, but sometimes they do. And I use it because funders want to see. Here's a manuscript. This is coming out from Macmillan next year. Presidential Wisdom for Teachers, Learning to Lead from the Commanders in Chief. Ike's one of the people they look at in here. There's a number of the presidents, but this is someone who went through one of our Medal of Honor programs, and in those programs, they received the character development training from the Medal of Honor Foundation. They took that idea, they turned it to a case study of 10 presidents, and this is actually a pedagogy manual where they're taking historical events from the United States and, you know, Washington faced this challenge. How do you face this challenge in your classroom? Or you have a student who, you know, is a behavior problem. Here's something that I came across. How do you deal with students like this? But it's this is going to press. I just did a blurb for it because he asked me for one. This is a teacher in California. But we see things like this where teachers go out and really try to think about how do they integrate this back into their schools, whether it's going back and creating some kind of special day event for their school, whether it's particular lessons about things, or here's a teacher who's actually trying to incorporate this into the professional development of their own profession, of taking those characteristics from the Medal of Honor Foundation, which, by the way, are courage, commitment, integrity, citizenship, sacrifice, and patriotism, and taking them into an American history class and really taking them in a direction that the recipients themselves sort of hint at, but never did overtly. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we've got a lot of things that show that what we're doing has a positive effect. And one of the simpler measurements, I'll put this way, I know if I can get a teacher from one area, it starts a flow of teachers. Like about 5 years ago, I got a teacher from Fort Smith, Arkansas, that I met at one of these Council for Social Studies. Every year we get 4 or 5 teachers from Fort Smith, Arkansas, because they go back and they see one of their colleagues doing things and talking about this stuff. And that's the important thing. Teachers talk to each other. And then obviously if it's a veteran teacher, there's another added effect there. But we really know in concrete ways, and this manuscript just happened to be one of the more recent ones.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Do you have anything else to add to that, Dylan, or? or good?
No, I was going to say, as far as it's almost the referral system, a lot of the veterans that are within their communities, when they go into the classrooms, their veteran friends and colleagues, they see what they're doing and the materials, we offer free flags, poster sized documents, educational resources online. They see what their veteran friend is offering through this VIP program, and then they hop on board as well. And then they make a real concerted effort within those communities, because it's really difficult sitting in an office in, Phoenix or Scottsdale, Arizona, to say, hey, I have this veteran in your area. Would you like him to go to the classroom? Who's this? So I meet these, people and connect with them in their cities and say, you have, a teacher, a student, or somebody to help you get your shoe into that classroom. So definitely.
That's interesting how the referral network works, because it's actually an indication of kind of larger dynamics between veterans groups when it comes to civics. So, there's not a lot of research but a growing amount of research. The Veterans Health Index that the National Council on Citizenship, I think I got that right, has done in 2015 and 2016 has looked at the participation of veterans in civic life just in general, and have noticed higher rates of voting and community participation and volunteering than non-veteran peers. And some people have taken a deeper dive into that recently and noticed that especially combat vets seem to have higher levels of volunteering and participation, and pass it on in ways, and that it's kind of through their network of veterans that they're interested in kind of moving into the community sphere and helping on. And so one of the questions, I think, we're winding down our time before we open up to questions, is what challenges are there? So we have, veterans on one hand, and we're part of this conference, at least if I understand it right, or part of my work in the veteran and society field is in making sure that we elevate the narrative of veterans as social assets, not as civic deficits. And so there are challenges around the narrative of veterans today, but then there are challenges in the civic education sphere. When you bring both together, what are the challenges that you or as organizations face that funders or those interested in philanthropic work should be aware of? Are they funding questions, or are they larger, broader questions that are outside the realm of philanthropy?
I think the reason we're having this conversation, I think the veterans, we do look at them in that aspect of how can we help them. But I think there's a huge influx of veterans, especially, being in a conflict for the past 19 years, where the veterans are not necessarily looking for help. They're looking how they can help and what they can do. They don't want to belong to these organizations. It's unfortunate sometimes a lot of the American Legion and VFW posts that have a reputation of being, a smoking and drinking establishment / club, where their original purpose was to help instill civic education within the community. And that's including public education in general. I think, as you mentioned, that was the original sole purpose for public education, was to teach students how to carry on what we built. But I do think there are a lot of challenges, because some veterans do need help, unfortunately. But it's getting into those resources and locations where you can find vets that are actively seeking out opportunities. And I think a lot of the young Iraq and Afghanistan vets are kind of some of the up and comers, so to speak, that are looking to see how they can give back. And then as far as, the other veterans I mentioned, it's been amazing. It's almost been 100% referral. I get in with a few of them, and then it just grows because they talk and people want to be involved. They want to do. But it can be difficult, especially when you want a World War II guy to go talk to a senior class or something. They storm the beaches in Normandy, but they'll be terrified of a group of middle schoolers.
Eugene, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there is a bit of a duality here. I mean, I think it's important to get the vets into the classroom for the same reason it's important for non-vets to do service. There's a variety of ways for any of us to serve the Republic. And I can think of, for example, Woody Williams, the World War II Medal of Honor recipient. He says this, people will ask him, should there be a draft? And he'll say, there should be a draft, but it should be a national service draft. So people can choose to go into the military, or they can choose to go do something else for the country, because there's a variety of talents. And I think it's important that people hear about these connections between military service and citizenship. But it's one of a variety of pathways. And I think it is important for at least some veterans. And I think, I'll be honest, my own father was a Vietnam veteran, severely wounded, and he carried that with him till the day he died. Shrapnel welded to bone, hearing problems, all sorts of stuff. That for some of these folks, it does help with those particular aspects too. I mean, I can think of Medal of Honor recipients and just other veterans. I have a Vietnam vet who every time I get him to come speak, he was in the Hanoi Hilton with Leo Thorsness and John McCain and all these guys. He thanks me profusely. And I always say, his first name's Ralph. No, Ralph, thank you. He's like, no, you don't understand. It took me years to be able to talk about this. And this is incredibly therapeutic for me, both, in terms of dealing with the PTS, but also in fulfilling my duties as citizenship and helping other veterans who maybe are having trouble talk about it, who might be teachers in the classroom or not, or, I think it's a really multifaceted, important thing that assists in both directions. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. Not all veterans are broken, but there are some that we know, because of suicide rates and this health index and all, there are some that need help. And doing these things helps them re-engage with the community. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge.
Absolutely. So we have one question, but before I get to the question in our queue, you mentioned John McCain, and that reminded me that there was this National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service that kind of closed out last year. I was privileged to be able to give a statement to them, and something that I said was that veterans are unacknowledged but permanent ambassadors of national service, not just military service. And so how we talk about them and portray them, in our larger narratives, actually has a bearing on how we think about national service. And so, yes, there are so many veterans who are, interested in these narratives of national service and trying to get more individuals into it. But there's just that larger question of purpose and the sense of purpose. And I can share an anecdote from an organization that I've done some research with and chatted with, which is the Veterans Campaign, which was one of the first organizations post 9/11 that helped veterans interested in running for public office just learn, what are the initial things. And they said that overwhelmingly when veterans come to them, they're not Republican or Democrat. They often don't, sometimes, and this goes again to our problems with civic education, they don't know there are two parties. I mean, oh my. And they often don't have specific policy. They're not, pro-tax policy or Medicare for all, or maybe they have some ideas. What they're overwhelmingly interested in is trying to help repair the civic fabric of America and increase and strengthen these questions of citizenship and civic education. And I think that is a narrative that we need to pull out more and definitely emphasize more. So we have a question very particularly about kind of pedagogy. And this is for both your organizations. How does your work respond, or how is it responding to the shifts in education that have moved towards being more inquiry focused with the C3, so that's the college, career, and civic life framework in Common Core? If you both could answer.
If you want, I can jump in first. I honestly, we respond very well, I think, and here's why. Is when teachers come to us, they not only receive the content, but as someone who's been in the classroom, as someone who trained teachers, as someone on a school board, I know that if I don't make that connection in a program with teachers, the likelihood of that information transitioning into the classroom goes down. So what I've actually started to do is there's a great, I think he's a great educational theorist, Sam Weinberg, who taught out at Stanford, who is as much rooted in history as he is in pedagogy. And his graduate students, now themselves professors, are peppered throughout the United States. Fortunately, a good number of them in the Philadelphia area. And much of that is very inquiry-based learning that is very focused on civics, very focused on original documents. And just like I've sort of developed a stable of scholars I work with, there's a stable of education professors who, in every program, as teachers get content, I will match up these ed professors with what the content is and have them actually go in and do pedagogical sessions with the teachers, maybe 2 in a whole program, but it gets the teachers really geared up that I know I'm going to take this back and I'm going to bring it back into the classroom. And I do it very, very, very intentionally for the reason that the question's asked. So.
Great. Dylan, do you have like a 15-minute question, second answer as we?
I know we have to wrap up, and I'll just say I've had it's had little to no effect as we're just bringing in guest speakers for an hour-long discussion. So little to no effect.
All right. Thank you so much, Eugene and Dylan, and thank you to all who watched this session. It was, once again, always a privilege to talk about these things with people in the field working on them right before Veterans Day. And Catherine, I think we'll round it out with you.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That was an incredibly thoughtful conversation between you, Eugene, and Dylan. So thank you all so much. One of my big takeaways, those signs as individuals enter school, enter to learn and go forth and serve. And so I think the conversation you all had today really certainly inspired that. So thank you for the work you do and for being part of this conversation. Again, thank you so much.